The funniest part was that the bees were doing exactly what the state needed them to do, while one woman was trying to have them removed. The first thing I heard every morning was the hum. Not loud, not aggressive, just a steady, living vibration rolling across the wildflower fields behind my property, like nature's version of background music. On that particular spring morning, the sun had barely cleared the horizon when I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and paused beside the first row of hives. Dew sparkled across the grass. The air smelled faintly of clover and orange blossoms. Thousands of honeybees were already beginning their daily work, leaving the hives in organized streams and disappearing toward nearby orchards, gardens, and farmland. Most people saw insects. I saw an entire agricultural workforce preparing for another day. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and for the last 15 years, bees had been my life. I understood their behavior, their health, their value, and the role they played in keeping local agriculture alive. What I did not understand was how someone could look at healthy, professionally managed hives and somehow convince herself they represented a public emergency. Yet that was exactly what Diane Mercer had done. I noticed her before I noticed the vehicles. She stood near the edge of the neighboring subdivision with her arms crossed, watching my property from a distance. Even from several hundred feet away, her posture radiated satisfaction. That expression immediately caught my attention because it was unusual for a Tuesday morning. Then I heard the sound of tires crunching along the gravel access road. 2 county vehicles appeared moments later and slowly approached the entrance to my apiary site. I took another sip of coffee and smiled. The bees continued flying. The flowers continued blooming. Nothing about the ranch seemed concerned. When the vehicles stopped, 2 inspectors stepped out carrying clipboards. Both looked professional and courteous. One introduced himself and explained they were responding to a complaint regarding potential public safety concerns associated with managed honeybee colonies. I glanced briefly toward Diane. She remained exactly where she was, watching the scene unfold like someone waiting for the final minutes of a movie she thought she had already spoiled. "Of course," I replied. "Come on in." The inspectors seemed slightly surprised by how quickly I welcomed them onto the property. Most people became defensive when government vehicles arrived unexpectedly. I simply opened the gate and invited them to inspect anything they wanted. Hive placement, registration records, health certifications, water sources, colony management practices, everything. As we walked deeper into the apiary, the hum grew louder. Hundreds of hives stretched across carefully maintained sections of land bordered by flowering cover crops and native pollinator habitat. The inspectors exchanged looks. One quietly remarked that the operation was larger than he expected. I pretended not to notice. Nearby, a worker bee landed briefly on a patch of blooming lavender before continuing its route. Everything appeared calm because everything was calm. Yet Diane continued standing beyond the fence with visible confidence. She believed she was about to prove that my bees were dangerous. What she did not realize was that every inspection creates records. Every record tells a story. And this particular story was about to become very inconvenient for someone who thought she understood far more about bees than she actually did. The inspectors spent nearly 2 hours walking the property, and by the time they finished, the morning sun was high enough to warm the tops of the hives. I accompanied them the entire time, answering questions whenever they asked and otherwise letting them do their jobs. They measured distances from neighboring properties, examined water sources, reviewed registration documents, and observed bee activity around multiple sections of the apiary. Nothing about the process bothered me because everything they were looking at had been designed to meet or exceed state recommendations. The truth was simple. Healthy bees required responsible management, and responsible management left very little room for surprises. As we moved through the rows of hives, the inspectors noticed details that most people overlooked. Shallow water stations placed throughout the property, carefully maintained vegetation, protective barriers positioned to encourage higher flight paths as bees left the colonies. Every feature existed for a reason. Every decision reflected years of experience. One inspector paused near a flowering hedgerow and watched dozens of worker bees moving between blossoms. "They seem remarkably calm," he said. I nodded. Healthy colonies usually are. Beyond the fence line, spring was transforming the countryside. Wildflowers painted patches of color across open fields. Nearby orchards were beginning their bloom cycle. Vegetable farms throughout the county were preparing for planting season. To most residents, those changes simply signaled warmer weather. To me, they represented thousands of acres preparing to depend on pollinators. Bees connected everything. Crops, flowers, gardens, orchards, and ecosystems all benefited from their work. Unfortunately, people who feared bees rarely saw that side of the story. They focused on the possibility of a sting and ignored the enormous value pollinators provided every day. Diane certainly seemed determined to focus on the danger. During the inspection, she never approached the group directly, but I noticed her vehicle parked near the subdivision entrance long after the inspectors arrived. Every time I glanced in that direction, she seemed to be watching, waiting, hoping. The expectation was almost visible from where I stood. She wanted someone in authority to confirm what she already believed. The problem was that evidence does not care about beliefs. Around noon, the inspectors completed their final observations and returned to the gate. One reviewed a few notes while the other thanked me for my cooperation. Their professionalism never changed, but their expressions suggested they had found exactly what they expected to find on a properly managed apiary. Nothing alarming, nothing dangerous, nothing that matched the dramatic description contained in the complaint. After they left, the property became quiet again except for the steady hum drifting from the hives. I remember standing there for a moment, listening to it. Thousands of bees continuing their routine without the slightest awareness that they had just been accused of threatening public safety. The irony almost made me laugh. Later that afternoon, I received confirmation that the inspection had identified no violations. The results surprised nobody except perhaps the person who submitted the complaint. I saved the report in a folder on my computer and returned to work. Experience had taught me something important over the years. When a complaint is based on misunderstanding, a single explanation usually solves the problem. But when a complaint is driven by pride, the first investigation rarely marks the end of the story. As the sun began setting beyond the fields, I looked across the apiary and had a feeling this was only the beginning. The next complaint arrived less than 2 weeks later, which told me everything I needed to know. Most reasonable people accepted the results of a professional inspection. Diane apparently viewed the inspection as the beginning of a campaign rather than the conclusion of one. I was replacing hive covers on a cool Saturday morning when my phone started vibrating repeatedly in my pocket. At first I ignored it. Bees required attention, and spring was one of the busiest times of the year. But after the fourth call, I finally checked the screen. 3 neighbors had left messages. Another had sent a text. A local gardener I knew well had also reached out. The reason became obvious almost immediately. Diane had started posting online. According to her version of events, the inspection had not solved anything. She claimed agencies had overlooked important risks. She suggested the community remained endangered. She encouraged residents to share concerns and document bee activity. Reading the posts felt like watching someone argue with gravity. The facts had not changed. The inspection results existed. The records existed. Yet Diane seemed determined to create a different reality through repetition. By lunchtime, screenshots of the discussion had already begun circulating through local community groups. Some residents supported her concerns. Others questioned them. A few people who actually understood agriculture attempted to explain how pollination worked and why managed honeybee colonies were common throughout the region. Those comments rarely lasted long before being buried beneath new accusations. I closed the application and went back to work. Experience had taught me that online arguments rarely improve real-world situations. The bees certainly were not reading social media. They continued doing what they always did: flying, pollinating, returning to the hives, producing honey, supporting local agriculture. The following week brought another HOA meeting. I did not attend because I was not a member of the subdivision association. My property sat outside their jurisdiction. That technical detail, however, did not stop Diane from discussing me extensively. Several neighbors later told me she dedicated a significant portion of the meeting to concerns about the apiary. Charts were shown. Photos were displayed. Predictions were made. One resident eventually asked a simple question. If inspectors found no violations, what exactly was the problem? Apparently, the room became very quiet for a few seconds. That question did not have an easy answer because the documented evidence kept pointing in the wrong direction. A few days later, I received another visit. This time it was not an enforcement action. A county agricultural representative stopped by after hearing about the growing controversy. He wanted to review pollinator habitat programs operating in the area. We spent nearly an hour walking through flowering corridors and discussing seasonal bloom cycles. During the conversation, he complimented the health of several colonies. Before leaving, he mentioned something interesting. Word of Diane's complaints had started spreading through agricultural circles. Not because officials believed them, because many people found the situation confusing. The operation was clearly professional. The records were clear, yet the complaints kept coming. That evening, I created a new folder on my computer labeled Community Correspondence. Into that folder went screenshots, messages, inspection reports, and meeting summaries. Not because I expected trouble, because documentation had value. Facts have a way of becoming important when emotions begin driving decisions. As the sun disappeared behind the fields and thousands of bees returned home for the evening, I watched the entrances of the hives grow quiet one by one. Everything looked healthy. Everything looked normal. Yet somewhere inside the subdivision, Diane was already preparing her next move, and she still had no idea who she was actually trying to fight. By early summer, the situation had evolved from mildly irritating to strangely predictable. Every few weeks, a new concern seemed to appear. Sometimes it involved bee activity near the subdivision entrance. Sometimes it involved speculative safety risks. Sometimes it involved complaints forwarded through channels that had already reviewed the operation before. The details changed. The outcome never did. What fascinated me most was how much energy Diane continued investing into a problem that existed largely in her imagination. The apiary remained healthy. The inspections remained favorable. The agricultural community remained supportive. Yet Diane kept pushing forward as though she were one document away from proving a hidden disaster. One warm Thursday morning, I was checking colony health records when a certified letter arrived in the mail. The envelope carried the familiar appearance of official correspondence. Inside was notice of another review request related to concerns submitted about the apiary. I sat at the kitchen table, read the letter once, and then filed it beside the others. By that point, the process felt routine. My wife glanced at the paperwork and raised an eyebrow. "Another one?" she asked. I nodded. "Looks that way." She shook her head and laughed softly before returning to her coffee. The truth was that neither of us felt worried anymore. Repetition had removed the element of surprise. Later that afternoon, an inspector arrived to verify several items that had already been documented during previous visits. He was professional, friendly, and remarkably familiar with the property. As we walked between the hives, he mentioned that multiple agencies often reviewed prior findings before conducting follow-up inspections. In other words, every new complaint arrived carrying the weight of every previous inspection attached to it. The statement interested me more than he probably realized. Diane believed she was building a case against the apiary. In reality, she was helping build an increasingly detailed history of compliance. Every inspection generated another report. Every report reinforced the same conclusion. The paper trail was becoming stronger with every attempt to challenge it. A few days later, I attended a regional agricultural gathering hosted several counties away. Events like these brought together farmers, orchard owners, crop specialists, conservation groups, and pollinator professionals. The atmosphere felt completely different from HOA meetings. Conversations focused on production, environmental stewardship, seasonal forecasts, and practical solutions. People discussed how to improve outcomes rather than manufacture problems. As I walked through the venue, numerous attendees greeted me by name. Some stopped to ask questions about pollination schedules. Others wanted updates on colony performance during the spring bloom. To me, these interactions felt normal because this had been my professional world for years. Yet viewed from the outside, they might have appeared unusual. Several organizers even invited me into discussions involving future agricultural planning. I never thought much about it at the time. Back home, however, Diane continued operating under the assumption that I was simply a local hobbyist who happened to own a few beehives. That misunderstanding was becoming increasingly important. The gap between what Diane believed and what was actually true grew wider every week. One evening, while reviewing correspondence at my desk, I noticed an email confirming my participation in an upcoming statewide pollination conference. I saved it, added several related documents to my records folder, and moved on with my work. Across the property, Thousands of bees settled into their hives as daylight faded. The fields grew quiet. The sky darkened. Everything appeared peaceful. Yet beyond the apiary, events were quietly moving toward a moment that would force Diane to confront a reality she had completely failed to recognize. The summer bloom season arrived in full force, and with it came the busiest period of the year for both the bees and the farms that depended on them. Long before sunrise, I was already moving through the apiary, checking colony strength, monitoring nectar flow, and preparing equipment for upcoming pollination work. The air carried the scent of wildflowers and warm soil. Thousands of bees streamed from the hives in golden waves each morning, disappearing toward orchards, berry farms, vegetable fields, and countless flowering plants scattered across the region. Watching them work never became ordinary. Every colony functioned like a living city, organized and purposeful. Unfortunately, while the bees focused on productivity, Diane remained focused on complaints. By midsummer, her campaign had evolved into something almost routine. New concerns appeared online. Questions circulated through community groups. Rumors spread faster than facts. Yet every official review continued, ending exactly the same way. No violations. No hazards. No corrective actions. The repetition was becoming almost comical. One afternoon, I received a call from a fruit grower several counties away. We had worked together before, and he wanted to discuss pollination scheduling for the following season. During the conversation, he casually mentioned hearing about the controversy surrounding my apiary. Apparently, word had traveled farther than I realized. What surprised him was not the existence of complaints. It was the target. Out of all the operations people could complain about, they picked yours, he asked. I laughed. Apparently. His response stayed with me after the call ended because it reflected something I had begun noticing more often. People within agriculture reacted very differently than people outside it. Farmers, orchard owners, and crop specialists understood what managed pollination required. They recognized the standards. They recognized the equipment. They recognized the infrastructure. To them, the idea that my apiary represented some uncontrolled danger seemed increasingly difficult to take seriously. Meanwhile, Diane continued viewing the situation through an entirely different lens. A week later, another HOA discussion centered on the bees. Several neighbors eventually shared details with me afterward. The meeting apparently followed a familiar pattern. Diane presented concerns. Residents asked questions. Someone referenced previous inspection results. Another resident mentioned that multiple agencies had already reviewed the property. For the first time, however, people began openly requesting evidence instead of opinions. That subtle shift mattered more than Diane probably realized. Once people start demanding proof, assumptions lose much of their power. Around the same time, preparations began for the annual statewide pollination conference. Every year, agricultural leaders, researchers, growers, and industry professionals gathered to discuss challenges facing pollinators and food production. I had attended many times before. To me, it felt like another work commitment. Registration confirmations arrived. Planning calls were scheduled. Meeting agendas circulated. None of it seemed unusual. Yet several small moments during those preparations hinted at something Diane never suspected. Industry leaders called directly. Organizers requested my input on several topics. Colleagues asked whether I would be attending specific sessions. The level of familiarity was obvious to anyone inside the profession. Outside that world, however, it remained invisible. One evening, after organizing documents for the upcoming conference, I noticed the growing stack of reports accumulated from months of complaints. Inspection summaries, agency correspondence, verification records. Every page pointed in the same direction. The truth had been documented repeatedly. Diane simply refused to accept it. As the sun disappeared beyond the fields and the final worker bees returned to their colonies, I closed the folder and switched off the office light. In only a few weeks, a room full of agricultural professionals would gather from across the state. And somewhere inside that gathering, a secret Diane had completely overlooked was waiting to reveal itself. The statewide pollination conference took place in late summer at a large agricultural convention center several hours from my property. Long before sunrise, I loaded a few materials into my truck and started the drive. The roads were quiet, the sky was still dark, and the fields stretching across the countryside looked almost silver beneath the early morning light. Conferences never felt glamorous to me. They were simply part of the profession. Every year, beekeepers, growers, researchers, conservation groups, and agricultural officials gathered to discuss challenges facing pollinators and food production. Most of the public never saw that side of the industry. They saw honey jars on store shelves. They saw flowers blooming in spring. They rarely saw the planning, logistics, and coordination required to support agriculture on a large scale. By the time I arrived, hundreds of attendees were already moving through the venue. Registration lines formed near the entrance. Exhibitors prepared displays. Conversations echoed through the hallways. The atmosphere felt familiar. As soon as I stepped inside, several people greeted me by name. A researcher from a university pollinator program stopped to ask about colony performance during the summer bloom. A large orchard operator wanted to discuss projected pollination needs for the following season. An agricultural consultant waved me over to introduce me to several new attendees. None of those interactions felt unusual because they happened every year. Yet viewed from outside the profession, they might have seemed surprisingly personal. Throughout the morning, I attended planning sessions and technical discussions. During breaks, people repeatedly approached me with questions, ideas, and project updates. At one point, a representative from a state agricultural office joined our table and asked whether I would be available for a later meeting involving future pollination coordination. I agreed without giving it much thought. It was simply another item on a busy schedule. What I did not know was that Diane had somehow become aware of the conference. According to neighbors who later shared details, she had spent weeks attempting to gather information supporting her claims about the apiary. Someone apparently mentioned the event while discussing pollinator programs. Curious and convinced she was uncovering something important, she decided to attend one of the public portions of the conference. She expected to find evidence supporting her position. Instead, she walked into a world she did not understand. That afternoon, a large gathering filled the main auditorium. Industry leaders, growers, agricultural officials, and pollinator specialists took their seats. Presentations covered crop production, environmental stewardship, and future planning initiatives. I sat near the front, reviewing notes while conversations continued around me. People stopped periodically to shake my hand or discuss ongoing projects. Again, none of this seemed remarkable from my perspective. It was simply work. Yet somewhere inside the audience sat Diane, observing a scene that probably looked very different from anything she expected. She had spent months treating me as though I were an irresponsible hobbyist creating problems for the community. Now she was watching respected professionals approach me as a colleague. She was watching agricultural leaders greet me by name. She was watching state representatives speak with me as though we had worked together for years. The pieces were finally beginning to move into place. The assumptions she had relied upon for months were starting to crack. She still did not know the full story. The biggest revelation had not happened yet. But as the conference moved toward its main evening presentation, the gap between what Diane believed and what was actually true was about to become impossible to ignore. The main presentation began shortly after sunset. Hundreds of attendees filled the auditorium while conversations gradually faded into silence. Warm lights illuminated the stage. Large screens displayed agricultural imagery from across the state. Growers, researchers, conservation leaders, and pollination specialists settled into their seats. The atmosphere carried a sense of importance because everyone in the room understood what was at stake. Modern agriculture depended on successful pollination. Without it, yields dropped, production suffered, and entire farming operations felt the impact. I sat near the front with several colleagues while the event moderator introduced speakers one by one. Everything felt completely normal to me. It was another professional gathering, another evening discussion about the work I had spent years doing. Yet somewhere farther back in the audience sat Diane, still trying to make sense of what she had witnessed throughout the day. She had already seen agricultural leaders greet me by name. She had already watched industry professionals seek my input. She had already observed state representatives treating me like a trusted colleague. The puzzle pieces were sitting directly in front of her. She simply had not assembled them yet. Midway through the program, the moderator transitioned to a segment highlighting major pollination initiatives operating across the state. Several projects were recognized for supporting farms, orchards, and food production. Then came the moment that changed everything. The moderator smiled and stepped toward the center of the stage. Our next recognition goes to a partner whose work has helped support pollination efforts across multiple agricultural regions, he announced. The state pollination contract continues to provide critical services to growers, and we would like to recognize the operation responsible for managing that effort. I barely looked up from my notes because I knew what was coming. Then my name echoed through the auditorium. Applause immediately followed. I stood, acknowledged the crowd, and walked toward the stage. The reaction felt routine to me because I had participated in these programs for years. What did not feel routine was the sudden expression I noticed when my eyes briefly scanned the audience. Diane looked completely frozen. For a moment, she did not appear angry. She did not appear frustrated. She simply looked stunned. The realization had finally arrived. The beekeeper she spent months portraying as irresponsible was the same professional trusted to help manage pollination services across the state. The man she repeatedly reported to agencies was already working with many of those same agricultural networks. The contrast could not have been more dramatic. As the presentation continued, several speakers referenced successful projects, agricultural partnerships, and pollination programs connected to my operation. None of the information was secret. None of it had ever been hidden. Diane simply never bothered learning who she was talking about before launching her campaign. After the session ended, attendees gathered throughout the convention center discussing future plans and industry challenges. Numerous people stopped to congratulate me or discuss upcoming projects. During those conversations, I occasionally noticed Diane standing at a distance. She never approached. She never spoke. She simply watched. For the first time since this entire situation began, the confidence she carried so effortlessly seemed completely absent. The assumptions that fueled months of complaints had collided headfirst with reality. And as the evening came to an end, one truth became impossible to ignore. Diane had spent an entire year trying to convince everyone that I did not belong in the beekeeping world. She had accidentally walked into a room filled with proof that I already helped lead part of it. The drive home felt unusually quiet, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the truth had finally reached the person who had spent months avoiding it. As the miles passed beneath the truck tires and the convention center disappeared behind me, I kept thinking about Diane's expression during the recognition ceremony. It was the look of someone discovering that an entire argument had been built on incomplete information. The funny part was that I had never hidden anything. The state contract was public information. My professional work was not secret. Industry conferences were open to attendees. Diane simply assumed she already knew the entire story and never bothered looking beyond her assumptions. When I arrived back at the apiary the following morning, the bees greeted me exactly the same way they always did. Thousands of workers leaving the hives at sunrise. The gentle hum spreading across the fields. Wildflowers swaying in the breeze. Nature had not changed because of a conference. The bees certainly did not care about recognition ceremonies. They cared about nectar, pollen, weather, and colony health. There was something comforting about that simplicity. Meanwhile, the effects of the conference began spreading through the community much faster than I expected. Several residents had attended portions of the event. Others knew people involved in agriculture. Word traveled quickly. Within days, conversations inside the subdivision started changing. People who had previously heard only Diane's version of events were now hearing something very different. They learned about pollination programs. They learned about agricultural partnerships. Most importantly, they learned that the apiary they had been told was a hazard was actually connected to work supporting farms throughout the state. The shift was subtle at first. Then it became impossible to ignore. A neighbor stopped by one afternoon while I was inspecting a group of hives. He leaned against the fence and laughed before saying, "I think some people just realized you might know a little more about bees than they thought." I smiled and continued working. There was no reason to celebrate. Facts were simply catching up to the story. Around the same time, several HOA discussions apparently took a very different tone. Residents began asking why so many complaints had been filed despite repeated inspection results. Others questioned why professional findings had been dismissed so easily. A few homeowners even referenced information they had learned about pollination programs and agricultural partnerships. The questions were fair. More importantly, they were based on evidence rather than emotion. Diane found herself facing the same challenge that every accusation eventually encounters when facts accumulate. The record existed. The inspections existed. The conference recognition existed. None of those things relied on opinion. They were documented reality. One evening, I sat at my desk reviewing the collection of reports that had accumulated over the previous year. Inspection summaries, registration documents, correspondence, verification records. What struck me most was how consistent everything looked when placed in chronological order. Every agency had reached similar conclusions. Every review supported the same outcome. The paper trail told a remarkably clear story. Diane spent months trying to prove the apiary represented a danger. Instead, she accidentally created one of the most thoroughly documented records of compliance I had ever seen. As summer slowly gave way to early autumn, the atmosphere surrounding the ranch felt different. The noise was fading. The assumptions were weakening. And for the first time since this entire situation began, people were no longer asking whether the bees belonged there. They were asking why anyone thought they did not. Autumn arrived with cooler mornings and longer shadows stretching across the fields, and for the first time in nearly a year, life around the apiary felt normal again. The constant cycle of complaints, inspections, rumors, and meetings gradually faded into the background. The bees continued their work exactly as they always had. They gathered nectar from late-season blooms. They strengthened their colonies for winter. They followed instincts that had existed long before homeowners associations, online arguments, or neighborhood politics. Standing among the hives one crisp morning, I realized how little had actually changed on my side of the fence. The operation remained the same. The records remained the same. The facts remained the same. The only thing that had changed was how people viewed them. Neighbors who once seemed uncertain now stopped by with genuine curiosity. Gardeners asked questions about pollinator-friendly plants. Local residents attended educational workshops hosted by agricultural groups. Several even volunteered during community conservation projects designed to support native pollinators and healthy ecosystems. Knowledge accomplished what months of arguments never could. It replaced fear with understanding. As for Diane, her campaign quietly disappeared. The meetings became less dramatic. The accusations became less frequent. The online discussions lost momentum. Every attempt to challenge the apiary eventually collided with the same obstacle: documented reality. Inspection reports existed. Compliance records existed. Professional recognition existed. None of those things depended on opinions. They simply existed whether people liked them or not. One afternoon, while organizing equipment before winter preparations began, I received a call from a grower whose orchards depended heavily on pollination services. We discussed next year's bloom projections and crop forecasts. After the business portion of the conversation ended, he laughed and said something that stayed with me. "You know, that entire situation ended up helping people understand what you actually do." At first, I thought he was joking. Then I realized he was right. The attention Diane created ultimately introduced more people to the importance of pollination, agriculture, and responsible beekeeping than any advertisement ever could. The irony was impossible to ignore. The campaign intended to remove the bees had accidentally educated the community about why they mattered. As winter approached, I reviewed the folder containing every report, letter, inspection summary, and piece of correspondence accumulated throughout the year. The stack was surprisingly thick. Each document represented another attempt to challenge the operation. Each document also represented another confirmation that everything had been done correctly. I considered deleting the folder, but decided to keep it. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. Facts matter. Documentation matters. Patience matters. Sometimes the strongest response is simply allowing the truth enough time to catch up. On the final warm evening before the first major cold front arrived, I stood near the edge of the apiary watching the last few bees return home. The sky glowed orange above the fields. The air carried the scent of dry grass and distant wildflowers. Everything felt peaceful. Looking across the property, I thought about how this entire story began with someone convinced she understood the situation. In the end, the bees remained. The farms remained. The partnerships remained. The records remained. And the truth remained exactly where it had been from the very beginning. Diane spent months trying to prove the bees were a problem. Instead, she ended up proving something far more important. Expertise does not need to shout. It only needs time, evidence, and the opportunity to speak for itself.